Uh, Today's scripture comes from the book of Judges, chapter 16. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites told, Samson has come here, and they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, let us wait till the light of the morning, then we'll kill him. But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gates of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and pulled them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. After this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means he may overcome him. Excuse me. That we may bind him to humble him, and we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please, tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound, and that we could subdue you. Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, and then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Then the lords of the Philistines brought up her 7 fresh bowstrings that had been not dried, and she bounded him with them. Now she had men lying in bushes in an inner chamber, and she said to him, Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he snapped the bowstrings, and his thread of flax snaps when he touched the fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if you bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak. And he, like any other man. So Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, and the men lying in ambush were in an inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. Then Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head with a web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So while he slept, Delilah took 7 locks of his head and wove them into a web. And when she made them tight with a pin and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled away the pins, the loom, and the web. And she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me with these 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed with death. And he told her all his heart, and he said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lord of the Philistines, saying, come up again, for he has told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him, and said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord has left him. The Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles. And the ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again, and after he had been shaved. Now the lord of the Philistines gathered to offer great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand. the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their heart were merry, they said, Call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to a young man who held him by the hand, Let me feel the pillars which the house rests, that I may lean against him. And now the house was full of men and women. All the lord of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women, who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, Let me die with Philistines. Then he bowed all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he had killed during his lifetime. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought up and buried him in Zorah and Eshtaol. In the tomb of Manoah, his father, he had judged Israel 20 years. This is the word of the Lord.
Good to have you all here. It's excellent. Thank you, Philip, for leading us in worship, Andrew for praise, Elliot, Minnie reading, and HJ, the real long reading, and Peter for your prayer. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all in worshiping. This is the last sermon on Samson and on the book of Judges. We started the study of Judges on May 15th this year, May 15th. Of course, it's been 7 months. Of course, we took 2 months break during July and August, and then we looked through the book of Galatians in those 2 months. And other than those 2 months, about 5 months, we've been looking at the book of Judges and going through all the major, I should say, Judges. I do want to remind you of this repeated theme of the book, and this will help us to understand and go back and get a broad picture of this. There's a repeated theme in this book, and that's going to be shown right now. The Israelites abandon God. They submit to foreign gods, and they're exploited. And they cry out to God for deliverance, and God raises up a deliverer. These 4 events happen every time, and then there's a new judge, and then they abandon God. They're oppressed. They cry out to God. God brings a new judge. Again, they abandon God. Foreign gods are oppressing them. Cry out to God, and God brings a new judge. And we come to this part of Samson. Now, within this 4 stages of their repeated theme of rebellion and redemption, we can see that this whole book is context in these 2 bookend verses. The first verse of chapter 1 and the last verse of chapter 21. And these are the verses here. This is Judges 1:1. It says, After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Who's going to be our leader? Who's going to be our king? We need our leader. Judges 21:25. This is the last verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Who's going to be our leader? Here at the end, it says there was no king. So what happened? Everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes. So they were like doing whatever. In the book of Judges, the people continually fall into idolatry. And we have studied already, and those of you who've been here before, but those of you who are here for the first time will see that in the book of Judges, that the Israelites did not fall into apostasy, saying that they abandoned God and transferred their religion to another God. That's not what happened. That's not what happened in the book of Judges. It was not, okay, God, we have no king, you're useless, we're going to worship the God of Canaanites and the Philistines. No, that's not what happened. What they did was, yeah, God is good, God is still existent, and He delivered us, but we're going to have other gods as well. So they mixed matched. It was a problem and sin of what we call syncretism. It was a fusion spirituality. You can have fusion food. That's okay. You can have fusion tea. It's okay to have coffee and tea together. Some of my friends were pretty upset last Sunday that, I'm just joking, of course. Don't take me seriously at this point. Right after this sentence, you have to take me seriously. But I heard some comments, oh yeah, of course, you can mix tea and coffee. That was in the context of last week's sermon by Philip. Of course, you can have fusion food. That's okay, to mix two different kinds and come up with another one. But fusion spirituality is syncretism. And that's what God was against. It says, no, you cannot have the God of the Bible and God of the Canaanites or Philistines mixed together. You cannot have that. That is a great danger for believers in a pagan world. Last Sunday, Philip said, one generation of syncretism will lead to next generation of apostasy. One generation of syncretism, mixing God with other gods, living in a pluralistic world, being spiritually pluralistic, or having fusion spirituality. One generation of syncretism will lead to next generation of apostasy. That's a serious indictment. I thought about that for a whole week. For a whole week, I thought about that statement. That statement did not leave my head. It was just lingering around all week. And this is what I wrote down in my sermon notes as I was listening to Philip last Sunday. And I was thinking about this. Maybe our children are more honest than us. Maybe we have seen that half-hearted Christianity is nothing to be serious about. If God is real to you, and if you believe that God is real, you must give your entire life to God. If you're divided in your allegiance, it's like having multiple spouses. I can't say I love Candace if I have relationships with other women. That marriage is meaningless. It's the same way with God. I can't say I love God if I love other gods too. Our children have seen us in spiritual adultery. No wonder. One generation of syncretism will lead to the next generation of apostasy. I thought about that for a whole week. I want to challenge you to think about that for another week. And within that idea of syncretism, we see Samson. When we think about Samson, what's the first word that comes to your mind? Power, strength, super power. But here's the irony that I think God intended us to see in the story of Samson. His strength was in reality his greatest weakness. Let me give you an outline of this important but long chapter. This is a very famous chapter, but long chapter, of course. This is how I have the outline here. Samson is physically strong, but morally weak. Samson is physically strong, but relationally weak. Samson is physically strong, but spiritually weak. Samson is physically weak, but finally strong in the Lord. We're going to go through this together today in the next 55 minutes. I was very, very encouraged last night. Philip preached 43 minutes, and I said, if he can do it, I can do it too. Samson is physically strong, but morally weak. We read the story. He uprooted the city gates. City gates have been about, they say, the commentators say, 10 feet high, 10 feet wide. It would have been made of thick, solid wood, or covered with metal, or reinforced with metal to withstand enemy force. These are heavy, large things, gates, and he would lift them, carry uphill to Hebron some 36 miles and 3,200 feet of altitude. This is a brutal strength here. This raw physical strength is just astounding, and this is the most amazing demonstration of Samson's strength. But this is all in the context of Samson choosing lust and personal pleasure. He saw a prostitute. He desired her. He went and spent the night with her. This is a one-night stand, a business arrangement, a cash transaction. There was no love involved at all. This is just, hey, she looks good, and I want to have sex with her. That was it. I think the author of Judges is trying to give us this physical strength as contrasted with his moral weakness. He was so strong physically, but he was overpowered by his addiction for pleasure. He thought it was okay to sleep around because everyone else did it. Remember chapter 21? There was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Everyone else is doing it. He's doing it. He's doing it. They're doing it. Why not me? I have the power. I have control, and I have all the strength that's needed. So I'll just do it too. He thought it was okay. But the power of addiction was so strong that he was helpless. He was helpless, completely helpless. And he was so morally weak. And that's what the author of Judges is trying to help us to see. Physical strength contrasted with his moral weakness. He's physically strong, but relationally weak as well. We can see further down. The last episode of Samson's life begins with weakness for women, or desire for love. His love affair with Delilah has become one of the world's most famous classic stories of betrayal. People wrote about it, painted about it, told stories about it, and we can see all the things about Samson and Delilah. This is a drama in 4 acts. Each shows the relationship of deception and falsehood. Here we see Delilah is prepared to use Samson in the context of false love for him in order to earn money so that she can be comfortable for the rest of her life, and she wants to use her or him. The Philistines believed that Samson had some lucky charm. They were always perplexed. What's up with this guy Samson? Is he Superman? How does he have all this power? And they thought that he had some kind of lucky charm that gave him superhuman powers. So they talked to Delilah and said, Delilah, can you ask where his power comes from? And if you get that information, we'll give you a ton of money so that you can be set for the rest of your life. And you can go to Adriatic Sea, and we'll buy you a yacht, and you can just cruise all right. You can do whatever you want. Just get that information. So she asked, Samson, my love. Samson says, Delilah, my honey bun, what can I do for you? And she says, you're so powerful. You're so strong. Oh, so strong. Where does your power come from? How come you're so strong and so handsome? Here's Samson's reply, verse 7, first reply. Cautious and foolish. 7 fresh bowstrings. And the Philistines were gullible and superstitious enough to believe that. Power, of course, wasn't there. Delilah gets annoyed. Oh, how come you didn't tell me the truth? And asks again, Samson's second reply, verse 11. If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Well, that didn't work either, as we know the story. Delilah is really frustrated. She asks again. Samson's third reply, verse 13. If you weave the 7 locks of my head with a web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So she did, called the Philistines, ain't nothing happened. And look what Delilah says in verse 15. Verse 15. How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times, and you have not told me where your strength, great strength lies. Can you imagine the tone of Delilah's voice? How can you say you love me? Your heart is not with me. I'm hurt. You lied to me. Is your heart with me? Do you really love me? The heck? She's frustrated. She's talking about love. So manipulative. And this is how often relationships without love go, especially young people. When someone asks you, how can you say this? Do you really love me? Oh, I'll stop there. But Samson was convinced. He's one stupid guy. So stupid. He felt bad, I think. I really think he felt bad that he didn't tell the truth to Delilah. Delilah says, how can you say I love you? You don't tell me the truth for 3 times. If it was once, I was okay with it. I got a little mad, but second time, I was a little more mad, but third time, you manipulated me. You're playing with me. Samson felt bad, said, okay, this is what happens. He was blinded by his need love and Delilah's false love. Verse 17 says, he told her all his heart. Can you believe this guy? I'm like, somebody talk to this guy. Somebody need to put some sense into his head. So dumb. Told her all his heart because he needed that love, that feeling of being loved. Verse 17, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I will become weak and be like any other man. I was a Nazarite. My mother, she conceived me, dedicated. And I was set apart to be a Nazarite. He obviously forgot that his long hair signified his Nazarite vow. Nazarite vow was to be separated from the pagan world. A Nazarite is a person who is separated from the world, set apart to serve for God's purpose. He forgot. He was okay with his relationship with Philistines. He wanted to get along with them. He never wanted to fight the Philistines. He wanted to be their friend. When they did something wrong, he wanted to say, oh, okay, it's okay. We're all friends. But he forgot. He was a Nazarite. He wanted to mix with them, intermarry with them, and party with them. And especially he wanted to have this woman Delilah because he thought he loved her. And this is what Samson is teaching us today. In 1 John 2:15, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. It's that lesson. You're in the world, but not of the world. If you call yourself a Christian, think about what that means. You are in the world, but not of the world. All Christians are, in one sense, Nazarite. Doesn't mean you have to grow your hair long. It's just outward sign of internal call. You're called. I am called to be a Christian. I am called to be different from the world, to be set apart from the world. Of course, to love, to serve, but to be different. And that's the lesson here. Samson was physically strong, but relationally so weak and emotionally weak that he was completely manipulated by this woman, Delilah. Let's move on to number 3. Samson is physically strong, but spiritually weak. I want you to look at verse 19 and 20. Verses 19 and 20. And it's going to show up right now. See? Verses 19 and 20. Look at what it says. Is there a way for us to show 19 and 20 together? No? Okay. Oh, I should have requested beforehand. This is what happens. You have to ask, and it shall be given. Verse 19, it says, she made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him. And what? And what happened? His strength left him. Verse 20. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he woke from his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Yes. What's verse 19 say? His strength left him. Verse 20 says what? The Lord had left him. This is very, very important. I think the author wants us to see this. while Samson is talking about his strength, the inspired author here talks about the Lord. His strength cannot be separated from the presence of God. The power that he had was actually in the presence of God in his life, awaking from sleep. He has no awareness of what had happened. And he said, I will go out. Oh, my hair gone? It's okay. I'll go out, kill them all. You see, he did not realize that without God, he was absolutely nothing. You see, when God begins to bless us, we so readily succumb to temptation to think that there's something particularly meritorious on our part, that we deserve something. That when God begins to bless us, we think, this is why I have all this stuff. Maybe it's money, maybe it's intelligence, maybe it's good health, maybe it's good friends, maybe it's good network, maybe it's good influence, maybe it's good looks, maybe it's whatever you have. You have many things. And the moment we enjoy, we forget the fact that it's all blessing from God, and when God leaves, that means nothing. That leaves too. And Samson didn't realize that. We find it very hard to admit that we are totally dependent upon grace. The older you get, the more you realize how fragile you are. We are totally dependent on His grace. John 15:5, one of my lifetime verses. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. Do you believe that? You will be happy if you believe this. You can do nothing without me, Jesus says. Samson didn't realize that. Samson thought, long hair, gone, that's all right. Nazarite vow I made before God, that's okay. I can do whatever. But he soon realized it was not his strength. It was his God who was his strength. And we must realize it's not your strength, it's God who is your strength. And he's totally broken. Or should I say, using one of these Christian songs, gracefully broken. Samson is physically weak, but finally strong in the Lord. Verse 22 begins with this word. Can we show verse 22? I'm keeping my MOL people busy today. Verse 22. What's the first word in verse 22? But. Whenever there's a but in the Bible reading, when you're studying the Bible, this is off comment. When you're reading the Bible and when you see but, usually circle it and study it, because this is a turning point for a new episode. This is very important. But although Samson was down, he was not finally out. Philistines had no idea that God was behind all of this and was still in control of everything. But anyway, the temple's packed with all the socialites of Gaza and probably Philistia, while thousands of other people gather on the roof to look at this defeated enemy, Samson. strong young man, killed all these people in Philistia. Completely knocked out. His eyes gouged out. Naked. And people are out there say, hey, look at that kid. And they were celebrating their victory and having him entertain them. But this is perhaps the moment of Samson's greatest spiritual strength in the whole drama, because this is the moment of his clearest dependence on God. Brought totally low and end of his resources, he now knows that only God can meet him in all of his need. So he calls upon the Lord, who is faithful to keep his promise. He calls on God. This is the second time we see Samson praying. Only second time that is recorded. Some people will say, we don't think Samson was really genuine here, not. It doesn't matter, because the point and the focus is not Samson anymore. It's God who still delivers. But in faith, Samson grasped the central pillars on which the whole structure depends. And sensing for the last time the inflow of this divine strength from heaven, he pulls the structure, and the author describes it this way in a very nonchalant, non-dramatic, as a matter of fact way. Verse 30, second part. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. He was used by God at the end. Samson's life is now over, and his legacy is set. We saw him in Judges chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16. And nothing can change what's recorded in Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16. He resisted God at every step. And that's part of his story. And we're going to talk about him. Every time we talk about Samson, we'll talk about his resistance, rebellion, and his drama with Delilah. Samson had promising beginning, but tragic ending. But you know what this is? That God still fulfilled his purpose in Samson's life. And he had to do it the hard way. Folks, Samson is not our hero. We don't elevate him. But we don't just get rid of him either, because he points to someone who's a real hero. And that's the whole purpose of this book. There's somebody who came with a salvation. Looking at all these judges, and particularly Samson, forces us to see the parallels between Samson and the greater hero, a greater judge, and that is our Lord Jesus Christ. From birth to death, and I hope in your small groups and community groups, you can study the parallelism we see between Samson and Jesus, even in his birth. How it's announced, and how it's set apart, and how it was unusual birth, and all these things, parallels that we see. And from birth to death, and I'm going to talk about death here and close out. What are some parallels here? You will see this in your community group material as well. So go to your community group and study this week. And if you're not, start going this week. You'll love it. Both Samson and Jesus were betrayed by close friend because of money. They said they loved. For money, he was betrayed. Both were betrayed. Both were handed over to foreign powers who occupied the land. The author wanted us to see that. The connection between Samson, and we don't just talk about Samson. Samson points to Jesus. Both were tortured, chained, and publicly mocked. And both ultimately gained victory over an enemy by their death. Through their death, they gained victory. Samson stretched out his arms, pushed against the pillars, and secured victory over the Philistines. Jesus stretched out his arms, took the nails for you and for me, and secured victory over sin. But here's a big difference. When Samson died and he was buried, he stayed buried. But Jesus rose from the grave on the third day, never to die again. And that's the big difference. And Jesus still reigns. And he is the source of power and strength and security and love. We don't need to go to Delilah for love. All the Delilahs of this world will manipulate us. All the power that we think we can have will be useless without us being connected to God. All this beautiful equipment, the sound that Andrew makes here, that all these wonderful folks, make here, and all the sound is useless if we unplug. Doesn't work. Unless you're connected, everything we have is useless. And though Judges 16 closes out the story of Samson in the Old Testament, it's not the last word we have about Samson in the Bible. Hebrews 11, 22 to 32 to 33 talks about Samson. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. The author of Hebrews looks at Samson and says, there's nothing to praise about Samson. But it's not about our accomplishments. It's about our faith and the author and perfecter of our faith. And then he closes out in verse 34. He says, made strong out of weakness. He was made strong out of weakness, not made strong out of strength. Samson's tragedy was his victory. His weakness had become his strength. When we learn that, weak people like us become valuable. When we learn that, our strength is in the Lord. That we don't have to try so hard to fit in to this world system by an act of syncretism, fusion spirituality, but we can say, Lord, the world thinks I'm weak, but in you I am strong. And this is what Samson is teaching us. I asked Candace last night as I was preparing for sermon, said, Book of Judges devoted 4 chapters on Samson. What's one lesson you got from Samson? And we had good discussion. I'm not going to tell you what she said. So deep, you have to figure it out. What's one lesson you get from Samson? If you can write it down. All right, when I think about Samson, this is one lesson I got from Samson. What is it? I want to read you a quote from your material, Tim Keller's commentary, and I'm going to finish with this quote. I'm going to read this, and this is very, very important, and it moved my heart. We now can begin to see how sin and grace function on 2 completely opposed bases. In grace, God takes even our weaknesses and failures and uses them for us. But in sin, we take even his gifts and strengths and use them against him. Our sinful hearts will find ways to use even God's blessings to ruin our lives. Sin and grace. Which path are you going to take? Grace or syncretism? You're not abandoning God in syncretism. You say, God is okay, so are the other gods. I'm going to read it again. We now can begin to see how sin and grace function on two completely opposed bases. In grace, God takes even our weaknesses and failures and uses them for us. And I've had experiences in this. But in sin, we take even his gifts and strengths and use them against him. Our sinful hearts will find ways to use even God's blessing to ruin our lives. Folks, I want you to be happy. I don't want you to be miserable. Don't take sin. Take grace.